We've sort of touched on almost all of these issues, right? What I want us to think about in the 1920s are the following things, right? And we're gonna touch on these two pieces, okay? First of all, technology. By the 1920s, okay, and we're sort of stepping from one side to the other pretty quickly here, right? By the 1920s, most American homes, but not all of them, are becoming electrified. Telephones are becoming slowly available and interconnecting Americans across the country for the first time in a very profound way. But during the 1920s, remember, coming out of World War I, there was this, let's call it this, right, pseudo-economic boom, right, at the end of the war. And in American industry, that meant for most Americans, that meant this idea that, for example, Americans had access to affordable cars for the first time, access to household appliances for the first time. American women have not just received the right to vote, but they've also received the washing machine in the home, right? And what does that mean? Well, that means more time to do other things with your life other than just doing household chores, right? So as the American home became electrified with household appliances during the 1920s, it freed American women up to take other pursuits, other jobs for the first time. I think all of us think of the image of the flapper and associate it with the 1920s. I want us to associate the 1920s and women in a very different way. I want us to think about women for the first time stepping out of the household and even taking those meager jobs of secretary and teacher and nurse for the first time. In other words, American women are becoming much more involved in American society for the first time than they had been in prior periods in American life. American women are certainly becoming much more involved politically than they ever had been in American life because of the right to vote. But American women are also doing other things. They're appearing in films. They're appearing in radio programs. They are film stars for the first time, and their image is being seen across the country. American women are shopping at department stores and becoming an important part of this consumer boom in the 1920s. All of these things are very important for modern American women, aside from this image of the flapper and this rebellion of American women in the 1920s to the established way that women were supposed to look, or they were supposed to act, or in some ways were supposed to speak, right? I want us to think of something else in the 1920s too that's really important, and that's the growth of American popular culture. Radio and film in particular have a profound impact on the growth of American popular culture in the 1920s. By 1927, the first films with sound are beginning to appear. American film becomes a global business in the 1920s for the first time. The other thing that I think is important to note about the 1920s is there is this rural-urban divide in American life. By the 1920 census, for the first time in American history, more people are living in America's cities than were living in America's rural areas. Now, Prohibition has heavy influence in America's small towns, in America's rural areas. If you're going to see speakeasies, if you're going to see people breaking the law, yes, you're going to see some people with their moonshine joints in rural areas. But most of the time we associate that with the development of organized crime and speakeasies that were in America's major cities, such as New Orleans and Chicago and Detroit, for example, during this period. I want us to think of a couple of other things too. The automobile meant that Americans were more mobile than they had ever been before. I tell you what, guys, because I'm getting so close, I'm right here. All I have to finish is the Depression, and we're done. I want to finish this today. I want to step into that next period tomorrow, okay? Because I think this would be good for us, because that will put us more on schedule. And I think I can finish this up fairly quickly because I have those bottom last 4 targets to hit. And we have to know what's coming, right? Because Americans have been doing what? Well, Americans had been buying a lot of these household items, these first cars, they'd been buying them on credit. The American banking system as we knew it was becoming strained during this period. American corporations by three conservative presidents, first Harding, then Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover. American industries were becoming deregulated. So was its banking industry and banking system during this time. Credit was easy to obtain. Buying stocks on margin using credit and buying and investing into American business was fairly easy for most people to do. But the real problem with what gave us the Great Depression really began in America's heartland. And it began with World War I. You see, during the First World War, Americans really stepped up to the plate, especially American farmers, to feed the Allied war effort for 4 very long years, even before American GIs get involved in the war. And what happened was simply this, and there's really two factors here, right? But they sort of intertwine with one another to give you the Depression as we think of it. The first factor was this, you know, American farmers had expanded themselves during the war, and for good reason. There were needs there, necessities there that the Allied powers had to have from American agriculture. So as American farmers expanded over that 4-year period and began selling their goods to international markets to help the Allied war effort, when the war ended, think about what recovered the quickest. It's not European industrial growth that recovers back to where it had been to pre-war levels. It's European agriculture. Add to the fact that Latin American agriculture is becoming much more of a global competitor and phenomenon too. So by the 1920s, American farmers are beginning to feel a crunch that they had never felt before for 2 reasons. European agriculture had recovered, and now there's new competition. And so American farmers who had had this market to themselves to a large extent, now all of a sudden they're not being able to sell in the same way on a global marketplace or market stage, right? And so one by one, beginning in the mid-1920s, we started to see a crisis in American agriculture and in the American heartland that we had not seen in other sectors of the American economy. And what does that strain? When farmers expand, as we said in the 1890s, they expand using America's banking system. Our banking system is built on credit. It's built on loans and mortgage, right? If you think about it for a moment, as farms began to fail and they're not able to pay off their mortgages, America's banking system became strained in a very profound way. So, when the stock market crashes in 1929, that's only the most visible symptom of a larger problem that's actually at work in the American economy. The second factor is this. You guys live in a society of throwaway items, right? You're always upgrading things. Everything from the television set at home to especially the consumer electronics that you guys use 24 hours a day. Well, in the 1920s, products were built to do what? Last. So therefore, there was no reason to keep buying cars. There was no reason to buy a car, you know, pay one off in 4 years and then buy another one, right? Vehicles, products were not made for that. Advertising didn't steer Americans in that direction or American women in that direction with household appliances either. They steered you in the direction that you were going to buy this product and you were going to have it for a lifetime. What's the problem with that? Well, it stifles 2 things. It stifles innovation. It means it's easy for industries to overproduce, right? So now all of a sudden, what do you have? After the stock market crashes, just this visible symptom, you have goods that are so devalued and currency because of the bank failures, right? And the fact that the government did not want to put any or inject any money into the economy, you have what we call deflation in the American economy. American goods and services are worth very little, but so is the currency that they would use to buy them with, right? And so by 1930, there is one element in the American government that occurs during the Hoover administration that really puts the nail in the coffin of most Americans. Number one, Hoover didn't believe in government intervention in the economy. He believed in what we refer to today as voluntarism. This idea that charities, that church groups, that people who, dating back to the early progressive era, like, for example, the Salvation Army, groups that in the beginning, right, had tailored to helping America's inner city poor and immigrant poor, right, that they could step up to the plate and they could help out the growing number of poor people who were losing their jobs during the early stages of the Depression. The problem with that's pretty simple. They became overwhelmed. You see, you couldn't buy enough goods to keep American businesses afloat. And your money was not worth enough, right, to be able to continue the process of purchasing, putting money back into the economy. The other problem was this: because banks failed, many people lost their homes. This had a tremendous effect on the American family in particular. But it had a huge psychological effect in particular on American men, right, who had always been the breadwinners for their families. We saw suicide rates in particular spike during the early years of the Great Depression. But the nail in the coffin was the Hoot-Smalley tariff, only one of many nails. But this idea that you would raise tariffs to protect the growth of American industry during the time of Depression. The whole point in being a capitalist society is that you sell your goods around the world to open markets. But now all of a sudden, whenever you raise tariffs, other countries did the same thing. And so what happened to global trade, the other outlet for reviving an American economy? It went into a slump too, right? Now, I think it's safe to say it's more of a world history issue, but it's certainly important for us to note that the Depression had a profound impact on the rise of totalitarian dictators like Adolf Hitler in Germany, and certainly Joseph Stalin is rebuilding the Soviet Union during the years of the Great Depression with his 5-year plans. In fact, more Americans actually moved to the Soviet Union than they ever did during the history of the country in the early stages of the Great Depression, simply because there was work, right? I think it's important for us to note, too, that 1932 is an election year. And Herbert Hoover has an important incident that profoundly affected, over 8,000 banks have failed by 1932. The unemployment rate by 1932 is roughly around 25%, probably a little higher than that, probably 26.5% or so. So Herbert Hoover is dealing with the crisis of the Depression. His administration opens up the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to try to help people with their mortgages. He begins to open some lines of credit to American farmers. He's certainly backing voluntarism as a strategy and charities as a strategy. But the major issue here is that Hoover also begins public works programs across the country, much like what the New Deal would do for the next 6 to 8 years, right? He just does these things way too little, way too late to make a difference in 1932 at the height of the Depression. So during that election year, there's another incident. Now, you guys probably remember watching this in video, which was the Bonus Army incident. Hoover's name, as the little video that you guys watched, had become a political punchline by 1932. You know, if you pulled your pocket out like this, you know, this was a Hoover flag, right? If you saw a group of shacks together on the periphery of a major city, those were, of course, Hoovervilles, right? And one of the things to understand about Hoover is he was not a good speaker. He had been a businessman most of his life. He'd been a philanthropist through most of his life. He'd served in government during World War I and throughout the 1920s, but in cabinet positions for which he was appointed and not elected, okay? The Bonus Army incident really seals Hoover's political fate. And it does so in this way. World War I veterans had camped out in Washington, D.C., looking for bonuses that they were not to be guaranteed until 1945. Hoping that the American government will provide them, take care, Joseph, thank you, that the American government would provide them with some money, right, to help them make ends meet. Instead, the federal government, and Hoover gives the future hero of the Pacific War, Douglas MacArthur, the orders to do this, even though MacArthur actually exceeds those orders. MacArthur was supposed to break up the camp of the veterans. But what he does is much worse, right? He actually torches it. And in the process, the casualties are 2 infants. FDR said after he heard about the incident, he said, you know, one sentence that tells the whole story for what's about to happen in this election and really set forth the course in American history for really the middle of the 20th century. And he said, you know, this elects me, right? Because it looked like, and certainly was the case, that Hoover was out of touch with the American people, not just in dealing with the Depression, but how the American people felt about their government and the responsibility that they felt like it had to help them during such an economic crisis. So FDR's first course of business, right, is to do this. Now, during the Hoover administration, it's pretty interesting. Mexican repatriation had actually begun. In other words, we were actually taking people that had come into the United States during the 1920s, during the pseudo-economic boom, and were looking for work from places like Mexico. We were actually deporting them in much larger numbers than ever before during the first stages of the Great Depression. Roosevelt doesn't reverse that policy until the beginning of World War II, when there's a labor shortage here, okay? And that's when, with the Bracero program, we actually bring Hispanic Americans into the United States in large numbers to work in the defense industries, right? Don't forget the rise of the Sun Belt also occurs and is a profound shaper and driver of the American economy in the second half of the 20th century. But that begins because of the defense industries coming to major American cities during the Second World War. What I want to focus on is this last part. First of all, Roosevelt has to deal with 2 crises. One's an environmental one. During the 1920s, American farmers in the stages throughout the World War I set of issues that American agriculture had to expand to deal with. American farmers had plowed up America's topsoil across America's heartland. In the late 1920s, a series of droughts then hit the same area of the United States. Parts of New Mexico, Kansas, Oklahoma, and southeastern Colorado are virtually wiped away in what we would refer to today as the Dust Bowl. FDR has that disaster to deal with at the same time that he has the disaster of the Great Depression to deal with. And how does FDR deal with the Great Depression? Well, he deals with it through a series of programs collectively that we refer to, of course, as the New Deal. Now, the New Deal featured 3 types of programs: relief programs, recovery programs, and reform programs, right? Relief programs are supposed to be immediate, right? You put people back to work. You do something that has an immediate, tangible effect in the economy. Recovery programs are to be with you until the economy rights the ship, so to speak, until the economy returns back to pre-depression levels. Reform programs are designed to prevent a depression from ever happening again, okay? The New Deal operated off of a concept. It's called deficit spending. Deficit spending looks like this, okay? Deficit spending means you go into debt to put money from the government back into the American economy by putting people back to work. As Americans go back to work, what do? Well, they spend money back into the economy. And when they spend money back into the economy and your pre-levels of employment, right, increase back to where they were before the Depression began, then you begin to do what? You begin to pay huge tax rates back so that the government can balance its budget again. Does that make sense to everybody? This is sort of the approach that FDR means to take long term with the economy. New Deal programs. Let's think of programs, a relief program like, for example, the AAA, right? This idea with the Agricultural Adjustment Act that you would get rid of certain crops, you wouldn't grow them, or you would destroy them so that you could do what? You could raise the prices that farmers would get for growing other crops or for growing less, right? So that you would stabilize the marketplace. Well, the AAA's becomes called into question and becomes unconstitutional by 1935, right? You have other programs like the WPA, a recovery program, right? Think about the WPA as doing what? Building public buildings, hiring photographers and artists and writers so that people not only do what? You photograph America's recovery from the Depression on the one hand, if you're people like Dorothea Lange, right? But on the other hand, you put money back into the American film industry. As people feel better about themselves and they go to the movie theater, it does what? It helps put money back into the American economy. And then you do what? You build buildings for public use, right? Schools, courthouses, post offices, right? Buildings used by the American public that people will be doing what? Paying money into consistently, but more importantly, putting people back to work to build in the first place, right? What else do you do? Well, you create an agency like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. You put young men to work, right? And what do you do when you do that? You train them to do a job. You give them a trade or a skill that when the economy recovers, they can continue doing to make a living wage. Other programs, and let's think about these. In FDR's 100 days, his primary target is dealing with the banking system. The FDIC is one of the first measures, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now if you put money into a bank, that money is insured by the federal government against loss, right? You have a bank holiday for 100 days. You close, 100 days, in the first 100 days for a couple of weeks. You close those banks, you restructure them, you reorganize them. You put federal money into them, right? So that people will start doing what with their banks? Putting their money back into those banks, right? And investing in those banks, right? You also create, for us, the SEC, right? The Securities and Exchange Commission. And what is it supposed to do? Regulate the stock market, right? So that you don't have what? You don't have the type of insider trading and you don't have the type of sham investments, right, that led to the Depression in the first place. And then you do something else that's really important. By 1935, you pass the Wagner Act, which does what? It gives huge concessions to the labor union movement. It gives workers a feel like the companies that are employing them actually have their best interests at heart. When you guys think of Labor Day as a holiday, when you think of the 40-hour work week, you think of weekends and you think of overtime pay for workers and benefits for workers for the first time, you're thinking of things that had their genesis from the Wagner Act. The other thing, of course, you have to take care of Americans who cannot take care of themselves. America's elderly and indigent. In 1935, due to the critics, like Francis Townsend, for example, and there were critics, Townsend's only one, but he gives you this influential idea of what becomes, of course, the Social Security program that does take care of elderly Americans still to this very day. There were other critics. Father Charles Coughlin, who was somewhat of, I would say, was actually an anti-Semite, who used radio to great effect. He believed that the New Deal was going too far. It wanted a conservative approach back to using government power into the economy. Another opponent of the New Deal, actually, Huey P. Long, wants to go in the opposite direction, right? It's never really stated what Long actually wanted to do, but there is this idea that Long wanted more government intervention, more federal money poured into the economy to help America's white working class. There's a couple of things about the New Deal that we have to understand for just a moment that are really important. The first is this. that some of the programs, like the NRA and the AAA, became unconstitutional by 1935 and 1937, respectively. FDR gets himself in political hot water in 1937 by trying to pack the Supreme Court with justices who were favorable to New Deal initiatives. I think you're going to find that one on your EOC. They almost always have 2 or 3 questions about court packing, you know. I think, I'm going to give my opinion for just a moment, but I think a lot of that's because of the conservative nature of Texas politics. I think that we write a lot of the criticisms of the New Deal into the EOC. And certainly the criticisms of the New Deal, there are some that are quite valid, because we have to end by saying this, right? While the New Deal made Americans feel better about the state of the economy by the late 1930s, while the New Deal certainly did put a dent into some of the issues of unemployment, and while the New Deal did give us some aspects that are still with us to this day, in fact helped prevent, for example, the Great Recession of 2008 maybe becoming worse than what it became, right? The New Deal did not effectively bring the Great Depression to an end. And it's only the massive mobilization for World War II that actually does that. I think what you guys would find interesting is this: the 2 countries that come out of the Great Depression the quickest, you know. The first, of course, is Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, right? His 5-year plans modernized the Soviet Union and put everybody back to work. That's why the Soviet Union has a leg up in some respects at the beginning of World War II, at least from an industrial standpoint, right? Not necessarily from a military one. But the reason why Nazi Germany conquers so much of Europe so quickly at the beginning of the Second World War is because Nazi Germany, the rearmament, the remilitarization of German society during the late 1930s under Hitler, right? It's safe to say that Germany provided the blueprint for getting out of the Great Depression in some respects, because it was one of the first countries to emerge effectively out of it by the time it began doing what? Annexing Austria, taking the Sudetenland, carving up Poland with the Soviet Union, and then of course invading 65% of Western Europe, right? So what is the legacy of the New Deal? Well, it's really 2 things. Some government programs that are still with us that do provide a safety net for elderly Americans with Social Security on the one hand, and certainly some regulations in the American economy that have benefited us to this day to an extent as well. It also introduced, and this is kind of where I want to end with, but it also introduced another question in American life too. Excuse me, that you guys are studying about right now because you're in Reagan, right? You know, how much and what should the extent be to which the government should be involved in the American economy and should be involved in American life. Think about it for a moment. Every president that you studied, from Truman through Reagan and now into Bush and Clinton, right? Have they dismantled all of the New Deal? No. Have they kept some of those reform programs in place? Yes. Have they favored on and off less government intervention in the economy? Sure. That's where we see a more conservative tilt after the Nixon years, right, and sort of away from what we saw with the programs in the New Deal. There is one thing I do want to mention, though, and it has to deal with the environment. And it's the TVA programs and other public works project programs, right? While the public works programs like the TVA did bring electricity certainly to areas that were in poverty and were backward from a technological standpoint and from an infrastructural standpoint throughout the 1920s and 1930s, particularly in the South. While they did do that, they also, of course, damaged the natural environment to some extent while trying to do it, okay? And the other thing that I want to add is this: while the Depression did, in some respects, the New Deal programs employed some women, right, in certain positions, World War II certainly provided an avenue of opportunities for women in American industry. Minorities do not see the same benefit from the New Deal programs, right, as World War II will provide for that jump start for the civil rights movement for the future. Any questions? Anything at all? I think we covered the whole period today.